Okay, so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. We have a very special guest, Marc Barnes, who is the founder of New Polity. So, Marc, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, I've been following your stuff ever since you've been writing on Patheos and then followed what you were doing with post-liberal thought, New Polity. So, just for people who are unfamiliar, give us some background on yourself, but also this project that you're working on.
Yeah, well, I'm a raging egoist and have been from a young age, and fully convinced that other people should know what I'm thinking, which, while usually untrue, has definitely provided a particular life for me, namely writing.
Sounds fun.
I've been writing on Catholic culture, theology, philosophy. I think kind of as with most writing in this field, it's sort of loosely structured around being annoyed at errors and difficulties within our society, and then seeing in the church real solutions. And that's sort of been the through line, I suppose, if you could put one in my various writings. But right now, it's really working with New Polity, and New Polity is a extended critique of liberalism as a philosophical principle, as a theology, as a heresy, as a mode of culture. It's a critique of liberalism as the antithesis of a Catholic society. And because it has that kind of somewhat broad scope, it is more than just me. It's many writers and thinkers, much more intelligent than myself, trying to tackle the various aspects of the many tentacled beast that is the Leviathan, liberalism. So, what that project means is, I guess the fundamental conviction is that the philosophy that we all live and breathe and eat is in fact a coordinated attempt to reduce the power of the Catholic Church in society and to prevent its establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. And that this is not just a philosophical project, but it's a historical project. This is a generation after generation of elites who see it in their benefit to suppress the Catholic Church through the unquestioned imposition of liberalism on Christian people.
So I'm curious to understand more about how this project came to be. First, I'm interested on an experiential level. Like, how did you come to terms with the fact that liberalism is full of so many errors, as you put it? Like, what experiences in your own life kind of led you to this conclusion? And then I'm curious to know more about the intellectual scholarly level.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's I think most Catholics are possessed with the sense that the real world is much richer and deeper and more exciting and contains more miracles than, for whatever reason, our current social order gives us access to. And I know this is a vague way to begin, but it does seem like there's a wealth, a beauty that's sort of breaking in at the edges of everything. And this is a frustrating experience. And most of the times this is an artistic experience, right? Where you are looking at a world of cars and corporate stores, and you're asking yourself something like, is this the way it has to be? Isn't there something more? Isn't there something greater? And so I think there's that very general, and the church really encourages this in its young people, because the whole world is supposed to shine forth with the glory of God, and yet we continuously build up a world in which that seems less and less true, and in which it requires more and more of a poetic vision in order to see the glory of God shining through all the concrete, if that makes sense. So if I could give a sort of aesthetic beginning, I would say that has haunted me in a way that I think it haunts a lot of people. That there's much more to life. And then in a discussion of liberalism, it just seems like there's a certain literalization of that, where there is a regulation of what can be talked about and what can be possible within a society through liberalism. So one of the obvious examples is that, the church within liberalism is constrained to making arguments that are not based on any revelation. So the world is very much cut short. So if you think about the arguments that the Catholic is constrained to make in terms of any kind of, whether something like abortion or something like capitalism, the one thing that's assured is that God will not be brought up, that there will be no divine justification for either the destruction of capitalism or the end of abortion. But in fact, the real world, it will be constrained to this material and finite existence if you're going to have any kind of political significance. Which is to say, oh yeah, you can talk about God as long as it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. As long as you're just talking about your private feelings or, something that's motivating you to look into other reasons that a godless world could accept, then God is okay, I guess. Mm-hmm. So there's a real cultural constraint on the Christian, on the Catholic, that does limit his world. You enter into this habit as a thinker of saying, okay, well, how do I get rid of God in this argument, and how do I get rid of the angels in that argument, and how do I shrink my world in order to get the Catholic Church to have any kind of political efficacy? How do I deny its claims in order to have some effect? And to me, this is just parallel with the, if you will, poetic shrinking of the world.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, what kind of environment did you grow up in? Like, what was life like as a kid?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was a kind, loving Catholic home.
Okay.
I have no great dramatic story. I mean, this is something where I have an envy of people with convergent stories, because they have something to talk about. Whereas for me, it's, if I'm evidence of anything, it's just that the faith can be transmitted. So I grew up moving around a lot. My dad was in the army, and my parents always made a great effort to catechize us and to have us receiving the sacraments. So it was a life in which the life of grace was never really distinct from any other part of life. So I don't know if that gives me particular insight. In some ways, it clouds things for me, because some things that just seem totally apparent to me, like it's just totally apparent to me that without regular forgiveness of sins, people go insane. But that's not necessarily apparent. So I have certain biases in that regard.
Okay, so it's interesting that for you, like, this project is coming from an experience of what the answers could look like, or what they should look like. Whereas for me, like, I'm coming from the inverse. Like, I was baptized in liberalism, if you will. Like, I was living and breathing all of it. And I guess because, like, my entire life is just like being immersed in this worldview, like, at a certain point I was suffocating. I was like, there has to be something else, otherwise, like, this is horrible, because I don't know, like, I grew up in a very kind of bourgeois suburban environment. I went to a public school where I guess, like, the main point of contention for me was the fact that, like, I intuited that there was more than just this very bland, neutral idea that, like, human nature is good. We just have to be nice to each other. We have to accept each other, be yourself, be a good person, the end. Because at first I was aware that, like, I am not the best person. Like, I have tendencies to, like, do stuff that's not good. So how do you explain that? um what about the fact that like we have these desires for things that we can't fulfill for ourselves? So like I intuited that there was this tension within the human condition, within reality. And every time I ask, like, why is that? Like, why am I inclined to do stupid things? Like, why is there evil and suffering? People will be like, oh, we don't ask those questions because there's no answer and you're going to drive yourself insane. The answer is to be yourself. I was like, well, how am I supposed to be myself if part of who I am is wanting to ask questions? They're like, well,
Sure.
don't be yourself in that way. Like, you can be yourself the way we're telling you to.
Sure.
And it was that, but it was also like all of this tension that you intuit, like it has to be psychologized away. Like the solution is go to a therapist and like they're going to neutralize all of it for you so you can just live again a very nice, comfortable bourgeois life and then die. And then what? So like it was being hit again, like coming up against this wall constantly that like you can't ask questions, there are no answers, no one's going to explain this tension within the human condition. That's when I was like, okay, I need to find something else.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like, like, okay, in terms of faith, yeah, like I found that, but still I was looking for an intellectual explanation for the experience I had in our culture. And I don't think it was until I guess I found McIntyre and Charles Taylor that I found a plausible explanation of what was going on. And that opened the door to a bunch of other people. So I'm curious for you, like, what did you start reading that enabled you to really understand the nature of liberalism and its effect on our culture?
Oh man, that's a tough one because it always seemed to me that I was reading things where the Catholic Church was being proposed as something that didn't fit the categories of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And at no point was that necessarily described as its opposition to liberalism, defined as the dominant philosophy of the Western world. But that's what it was. I mean, that was what was being discussed. So I'd be remiss not to point to Chesterton as the kind of, and I think he is this for a lot of people, this kind of like splash of cold water where you get to wake up from the ironclad categories of the world. So be able to say, well, neither capitalism nor socialism, but this thing from which both of these ideologies depart. Neither a materialism nor a spiritualism, but the church's teaching on um, the unity of the two. So definitely Chesterton, and then I guess what I would say is that when things got explicit in terms of like not so much a general boosting of the church over and against the world, which is, I mean, it's been around for a while. But in terms of actual like naming liberalism as the disease and naming the grace that comes through the church as the cure, it was probably reading D.L. Schindler's Heart of the World, Center of the Church. Have you ever read that one?
I have not.
It's a great summary of communio theology and just it's funny because I really didn't know what I was reading when I picked it up. It was one of those bookstore moments, like, oh, this looks interesting. I'll check this out.
Yeah.
And then I just found myself immediately changed because he makes the argument in there that there's nothing at all neutral or about a exclusion of theological argument from the realm of public reason. That this is in fact theology. To say that religious arguments do not apply is to have a particular religion. To say that God can't enter into this conversation is to say something very particular about God and about the men having the conversation. And it's such an obvious point, right? That you don't get to exclude the revelation of the scriptures or God without making claims about scripture and about God.
Yeah.
But that had gone, I just had totally missed that. It was just this total awakening where I'm like, oh no, this is not a rational exclusion of scripture. This is a alternative scripture. This is not a enlightenment attempt at getting to better agreement because we tend to disagree on theological matters. This is a theology that's being imposed sort of a priori. So waking up to that and being like, yeah, no, I don't want to live in a world in which I have to neuter Catholicism and really theology. And then again, and Schindler points to how this also then is a neutering of philosophy in the end of the day, in order to make arguments about how the world should be. So
yeah, I didn't find that kind of critique of secularism until I think it was Torture and Eucharist by Kavanaugh, who's been on here before, and then through him I found Milbank and Radical Orthodoxy, and like it was interesting finding them after having been forced to read post-structuralists like Foucault when I was at a certain Jesuit university. But yeah, like they're using this kind of postmodern, post-structuralist model to critique secularism itself as a social construct, which when you think about it, like who are we to claim that there is no God? Who are we to claim that everything is morally neutral? Like we just made that up. And I think like this then goes back to my childhood experiences of having this sense that no, everything isn't neutral. Like things are charged with meaning. And that the claim to neutrality really is deceptive. And I think this is when I'm thinking of Schindler's book. Is this, I don't know if it's older Schindler or younger Schindler, Freedom from Reality, the one that came out. Yeah. So like this claim to neutrality that comes from, this liberal worldview is diabolical because it tells you one thing. It tells you we're neutral. It tells you everything's fine. You can trust those who are in authority, but in reality, there's no basis to it. So just being able to call that out and recognize that, like it validated so much of those things that I felt growing up.
Yeah. Well, and I think there is, you mentioned how this is a confirmation of experience of childhood. I think this is one of the ways in which in our day and age, we're called to imitate children in order to enter the kingdom. Because, as a child, you really do live in a moral universe. And it's taken as a sign of adulthood that you no longer do, right? That you exit the moral universe and you enter a universe that's solely a narrative without an end.
But it's also boring if everything's neutral. Like life is fun.
But it's also totally, it's just obviously a lie, right? Because what we really live in is not a world of carefully kept free speech and rational debate and a sort of withdrawal from moral questions for the sake of social unity. We live in a hyper-moralistic age in which we are entirely arbitrarily declaring things to be devastatingly sinful, and then seeming to forget about them the next day. I mean, like, you just don't actually get the world that's promised. What you get is a world that's unhinged. And this is, of course, how going crazy works, right? Going crazy is the result of detaching yourself from the truth and saying that it's non-existent, and then imagining that you're going to get some kind of ethereal floating through half-truths. But instead, what you really get is just any old thing, any old claim, any old opinion becomes a powerful weapon. So
So then on the other piece of this like neutrality thing is that we see that a lot of people claim to champion the oppressed, those who are the underdogs, really have this elitist interest behind what they're doing. And you focus a lot in your writings and in the videos, the podcast that you do on the uprooting from the particular, from the local, from nature in general. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on how this kind of elitist drive to, as much as it performs this,
Yeah.
goodwill towards those who are, oppressed.
Yeah.
What is that? What do you see happening there?
Well, gosh, it's in some ways it's a big question, but what helps clarify it for me is to be very clear about the ends of a just society, or like what what practical ends would a society that was good to the oppressed and was just, what would they achieve? Because I think people are kind of psychotic about this because they somehow think that the just society is one that like spiritually recognizes the validity of identities or something, as if as if like that would have satisfied anyone for most of history to have recognition of the validity of my identity. It's like, no, thanks, man. No, I mean, like, what is actually, and I'm just thinking biblically here, is the distribution of property and the actual giving of power over to the weak and the oppressed. This alone suffices for the just society. It's not, I mean, you have to have more than words, you have to have actions. And so what justice actually looks like is giving each his due, and what that actually amounts to is each particular real person having the means that they need to live a life that flourishes towards an end that's understood within the community, his community, and ultimately within a sort of universal order. The fulfillment, in Catholic teaching, we talk about this as like the fulfillment of one's vocation. Justice is the distribution of power and property and land to achieve that end. Now, it seems to me that we are allowed to support the oppressed or the weak or like the vaguely marginalized, whatever exactly that means, only insofar as we're not talking about that end.
Yeah.
Only insofar as we're talking about a purely spiritual and intangible exercise, where what we are doing is, I mean, obviously there's like the knee-jerk right-wing critique, which is that, well, we're like virtue signaling or something. We're just trying to show how aware we are of oppression, and then say that we're on the side of the oppressed in order to really bolster our own power. Because appearing righteous is a way of holding power. So, but no, I just think it's like what the emphasis on a kind of global sense of justice and a global sense of the fight against oppression. What this does by uprooting it from any particular cause is it also uproots us from the responsibility of providing any genuine results.
Yeah.
So it's like we maybe identity politics is one of the easiest places to see this, right? Like identity politics takes as its sort of presumption that if you can gather a people who are unified on the basis not of place, not of actual communion, and certainly not of mutual holding of property or power, but on an identity, a marker that's known by a third party alone, then this is a sort of height of politics, of justice. But what seems particularly obvious to me is that, well, when that becomes the work of justice, what you're not trying to do is have any real living instantiated communities in which the oppressed are actually relieved and given property and power with which to live flourishing lives. Instead, it's just it becomes increasingly a matter of intangible goods like recognition, which I don't think ultimately satisfy.
Yeah. And it makes me think, like, reading people like Milbank, like Kavanaugh, you also see that this the drive behind this globalist agenda basically is to remove any fetters to creating this identity of consumer, where like who you are is basically your capacity to give money, or
Yeah.
give money to these major corporations. So like getting rid of gender identity um, facilitates
Sure.
transition into becoming this consumer identity.
Right. Yeah. Because once you're uprooted, so where do we receive who we are? We receive it from our families, from our friends. We receive it from our vocation, which is precisely our embeddedness within a society working for the common good. That's what our vocation is, and that's how we answer the question who we are. Well, I'm this son, I'm this daughter, and I do this thing for the sake of these people. I mean, this is what gives us great comfort, I think. But the once you're stripped of all that, so once we're atomized consumers, we don't really have communities. Families are only sort of incidentally cobbled together for the sake of producing individual adults, and then they dissipate after the age of 18. Once that is the norm of society, what is to the elite classes, then you can sell people things that claim to establish that same type of belonging, that same sense of belonging, the identity that they need to politically survive in this world can now be sold to them. This is why like political identity groups are indistinguishable from the creation of market, like groups to market to, because it's one and the same movement. By stripping people from sources of belonging, you can then sell them belonging as a product. I mean, this is, I read Ivan Illich a lot on this. Illich, I don't say that aloud a lot. But he talks about the manufacturing of scarcity. It's like, gender is a good example one I've used before. It's like, well, historically, gender is something received as a gift. It's received and it's dealt with and it's suffered as something that comes from without and that makes us belong within a society, whether we would like to belong in that way or not, which is why it's both wonderful and painful at the same time. But what you can do is if you can deny that, if you deny that sexual difference is a gift and redefine it as an achievement of man, which has essentially been the project of postmodern queer theory, and really I would argue liberalism, period, then you can sell gender as an achievement. And I mean this very practically. I mean, once it's really true that gender is a construct that you establish by growing your hair a certain length, then you can sell shampoo.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it is as lame as that too. It's like once masculinity is a construct that you establish by repeating certain norms, then we can sell you protein powder. And it's tough because the people pointing this out, especially within the gender question, always want to be the radicals, right? Who stand back and say, look, this thing you think is so solid and secure is in fact just a series of repetitions that could be otherwise. That's the whole postmodern thing. But what they don't see is that well, they're quite right, actually, but they're right about the wrong object. I mean, they are right that gender, for instance, has been commodified and turned into a product for sale.
Yeah.
But what they're wrong about is that this is somehow the Christian project. I mean, what they're really attacking is the anti-Christian project, and then they are modifying. They're not questioning that gender is not a gift. That's taken as a presumption. What they're questioning is simply the different things that you can do in order to have this man-made construct of gender. So what it becomes is for people like conservatives, it's like, well, conservatives think that gender is a construct. Absolutely. It's just they think it's a construct that happens with, that is built through having a particular anatomy and then, being muscular or something. And then queer theorists are the ones who say, no, it can also be, and then they name a bunch of other stuff as if that's as if that's the fight. But the fundamental problem is that we no longer receive sexual difference as a gift from God. We now craft it as an artifact of man.
Yeah, and I think like if we're thinking of queer theorists or gender theorists like Butler, like she's onto something about the performance of gender in, you know, late capitalist modern society, but the fact that she insists that, you know, metaphysics, ontology is oppressive, it's a social construct, that's it just sets us up for this elitist super capitalist notion of the person. And it's like ironic to me that she doesn't realize what she's doing. I mean, I think she knows what
Yeah.
she's doing, but it's
Yeah.
deceptive.
Yeah, it's like queer theorists, all they're really doing is expanding the number of products you can sell to people. It's like, at first, all we were selling was like, you know, beauty products and, you know, now we're selling like, you know, surrogacy, and we can sell, you know what I mean? Like how does capitalism work? Well, it works by creating markets where there aren't any.
Yeah.
And it's just very obvious to me that the only way to create a market where there isn't any is to get rid of gifts, because wherever there's gifts, you don't have that need. It's being met by the gift. So you strip people of the gift of, say, a sexual identity, and then it sets them off into a world of anxiety in which they have to do things in order to get what was once received. And that's the project that Butler is, of course, a big proponent of. I mean, she is definitely part of that capitalist work of turning gifts into products.
Yeah.
I don't know that she sees it. Maybe.
I think the people who employ her see it and very much like it. The people who publish her.
Well, and people get confused, right? Like, why are all the corporations now like LGBT friendly and such? And it's like, I think that's maybe part of the reason why New Polity is hopefully helpful. Is it's saying like, look, if this surprises us, it's because we haven't yet critiqued our society deeply enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, given a society in which we're trying to reduce all gifts to products in order to profit an elite, then yeah, of course this is going to happen.
Yeah, and it makes me think of, have you read Augusto Del Noce's stuff, the Italian?
Yeah, well, what's translated?
Yeah, because he talks about the transition from the old left to the new left. So the old left being more based on, you know, class politics, traditional Marxist kind of critiques, shifting from this identitarian, individualistic kind of idea of progress. And you see how like the shift away from actual class struggle, like actual poor people having valid, legitimate needs, shifting from the freedom to do what I want as an individual. And like it makes me think then of like people like Cardinal Sarah, what's her name, Obianu Ocha. So these like African Catholic writers who are basically calling out the elitism of Western liberalism, that's saying like, you know, her letter to Melinda Gates, that you are such a great humanitarian, you want to come to Nigeria and you want to spread birth control and abortion. But why? Because you want to eliminate African lives because they're an inconvenience to you, but also because the fact that the family is sacred for most African cultures is also a threat to these major corporations. Like that's when you start to see that not only is it deceptive, but it's actually doing damage to oppressed people, taking away what's due, as you said, to
I mean, it seems so obvious, but we have yet to question that the kind of material luxury that the West provides. We've yet to question that as a good. I mean, we just say like, if it provides it, then it must be good. So one of the places you see this is in the promotion of contraception in Africa. There's a lot of studies about the various barriers to contraceptive access, right? Because what's assumed, of course, is that contraception is a
All
good
right.
that everyone wants. And so the question is simply, how does the river of contraception flow properly? And then one of the barriers, of course, to access are cultural barriers. And this gets discussed among the elite and academics of, okay, well, what are these cultural barriers? And then the more you scratch it, the more you realize that, well, one of the cultural barriers is that people don't want it. And that one of the, solutions to the cultural barrier of people not wanting it is education, which is, of course, getting them to want it. And of course, Western expansion of capitalism has never gone by any other means, but by disrupting places of contentment and peace in order to introduce needs in and through the destruction of communities that met those needs in other ways. So I was reading a study, again, from the promoters of contraception, who are arguing that one of the problems with the access to contraception in Africa is that Africans value family size because they have an agrarian, that often they have an agrarian lifestyle. And they're talking about particular African countries, obviously. So one of the solutions to this is greater urbanization. And you think about this, like, it's just so blithely thrown into this boring study. But you think about what is really being said here. It's like, there is a people created by God who have found that they love to have children because children are in fact useful and good to the way in which
satisfying,
yeah,
essential level.
Yeah, and that this is a problem that prevents them from, namely, attaining goods that they are not actively pursuing, which for these Western educators is always like college education and more money, because we just presume as mammon worshippers that the only value is, of course, at the end of the day, more money. And so we actively disrupt these cultures, and we do it in a way that just benefits us. And because who's the one that's going to urbanize agrarian societies? Well, it's always the capitalists. It always has been and always will be. So like our very outreach is just self-evidently trying to turn the entire world into a Western liberal global state. And we do it through, and I think that the academics are fooled at some level. They just buy the premise that, of course, contraception is a good, within my atomized, urbanized existence. So it must be a good elsewhere. Oh, these people don't want it. Well, we must atomize and urbanize their existence. Then, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, but on that point about like this ideal of total atomization and sterilization, the people who advocate for their right to be atomized and alone without any source of, as you said, like the kind of economic resources of having a family, but also the existential meaning that it provides.
Yeah.
Why do you think people are so unaware of the fact that what they're advocating for is their own demise, their own being very miserable and empty? Because like for me, it's sad. Like I'm sad that people are advocating for this for themselves,
Yeah, I mean,
it's blindness.
I don't know. Don't you think that part of our regime's work is to build up little worlds in which atomization is rewarded and individualism is rewarded, and that people are just convinced, not so much by the state of life, but by the rewards? I mean, if you're able to make a bunch of money, for instance, and have very little that you have to give it to, then you access a society that's deliberately created so that money is its predominant value and the marker of value. Like, it is just true that if I don't have any kids and I am sterile and I am healthy and I'm in my 20s and I am working in tech, that I'll have a bunch of money and I will be able to be rewarded through that. Now and I just think that it's pretty much that simple. I mean, you could say, well, why don't they realize that these rewards are empty? These rewards are lies. It's like, well, I think that there needs to be real conversion, but that shrinking of the world that's achieved within liberalism allows us to briefly live out these illusions where the kind of goods we can get from liberalism do really make all of the conformities seem worth it. Maybe it's a really long-winded way of saying people love money, and they're educated to love money, and then liberalism promises that they'll get it, and the only sacrifice is sacrifice of things like basically anything that would ultimately give you intergenerational power as opposed to individual power. You know, one thing I was thinking of was that was in the history of, or really just a descriptive history of eunuchs I've been reading. And in a lot of cultures, what was amazing about the way eunuchs lived is that by sterilizing themselves and thereby separating themselves from the good of family, they could be superbly committed to whatever centralized power could use them, which is why the eunuchs were always associated with the large administrative states as part of their bureaucracies. Something like China, for instance, the Ming Dynasty, for instance, but also in Assyria, and also just wherever it comes up within, Muslim caliphates and such as well. But that state of life was also one in which eunuchs could accrue a lot. I mean, there's a lot within these histories of eunuchs becoming fabulously wealthy when otherwise they would have, had they not been sterilized, usually by their parents or by their own choice, they wouldn't have been able to manage to break into that world of administrative power in which you get all these privileges and rewards. But what happens to a eunuch's wealth, like what the power that he accrues, so his property, his land, his money, whatever it is, well, upon his death, since he's made that decisive separation, it would usually be the case that all the wealth would go back to the state.
Okay.
And I think there's this, it's a bit of a, I don't know, maybe I'm being malicious if I say we're all eunuchs now, but I think there's something to it.
That's true.
Because we are allowed to get rewarded and to benefit and to accrue and to amass and to be selfish and to have, cool things, but only insofar as we are content to live a life in which that never builds up some kind of rival power to our elite. So we're convinced to just spend it on luxury items. We're convinced to not have intergenerational power that grows. We're convinced not to accrue land, but to live lavish lifestyles while renting everything we own. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The idea is that upon our death, we maybe, made a lot of bright lights, but ultimately don't affect the basic structures of power in society.
Yeah. It makes me think of, did you read Chris Aronati's book, Dignity?
No, I did not.
Yeah, so he basically was this Wall Street stockbroker who was, very progressive, on the right side of history, blah, blah, blah. But at a certain point realized everything he was living was empty and decided to go just hang around the poorest low lives that he could find. So he started out in the Bronx and then just traveled around the country to what he would call basically these back row communities as opposed to these front row college educated coastal elites. And he found that for these back row people, sure, a lot of them lived in poverty, but they were rooted in family, local community, more often than not, a faith community. And these people were generally happier. And it makes me think that, again, what you're saying about the intergenerational loss here, it's also, again, this existential spiritual loss that without grounding, without roots in something that transcends you, that transcends time, we're so vulnerable to despair, because then the smallest crack that shatters our worldview, our complacency, we're screwed, we don't have anything to fall back on. And this is what leads to nihilism and ultimately to suicide, unfortunately. But again, it's it's scary to me that the people who are on the back row, people who are oppressed, are being told that if you join the front row, you will be happy. If you go to college and get a job in STEM or whatever, it's your ticket, when really it's your ticket to being miserable, probably.
Yeah, ultimately, I think we just stretch out. I mean, it sounds like some old-fashioned Catholic moralism, but it's just true. Like the pleasures of the flesh that are available to us are a game of diminishing returns. Everyone knows this. It's just that we think somehow, in our case, this time, the returns won't diminish.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I don't know. I just feel like we used to know this, or maybe we do know it. It's just like it's not an intellectual problem. It's a problem of the will. Because I don't know. You think about movies like It's a Wonderful Life or something, like the like good old kitschy American movies. Like, just we'd love to again and again point out that, like, yeah, having money doesn't make you happy. Family makes you happy. No one would deny that, but everyone lives like they're denying that. It seems to me to be this cognitive dissonance because we can't say no to our passions.
But I think when that's presented in a moralistic way, which it is usually in the movies, especially old movies like that one, like, it holds no weight because there's no real ontological proposal behind it that really captivates you. It's just like, oh yeah, sure, I know money will make me happy because it won't last. I shouldn't do that. But it's not that you shouldn't, it's that your being is something else. Like, no one's telling you that this is who we are. It's just, oh, you shouldn't do X, Y, and Z. You know?
It's why I sometimes like speaking in terms of power, like, because I think most people are attracted by the idea of gaining power, even if they don't quite know what that means. And unfortunately, power, of course, has this, well, I don't think it's accidental that it has a bad rap. I think that it's very fitting for a society in which actual power is amassed by very few for the amassment of power to have a bad rap, if that makes sense. But what I mean is just capacities. Like, we are creatures within nature, and that nature comes with capacities, and the use of those capacities is what fulfills us, in the same sense in which the capacities of the tree are fulfilled in its flourishing. It's like, that is what we mean when we talk about the amassment of power and or rather the maximization of our powers. So I always want to, when I meet someone that's sort of obsessed with money, it's not that I want to say, like, oh, you should really think about being rooted in a particular community and serving others rather than just serving yourself, because it's going to make you feel empty and hollow inside, all of which is true. But there's a positive way of saying it. It's like, well, look at the kind of being you are. You are a kind of being that has all of this capacity to do and to make, and that requires, and that is enabled, the flourishing of those capacities is enabled by staying in one place, by having solid relationships in which you can work with people towards a common good, by being able to deny yourself pleasures, by being able to fast, by being able to you are dissipated in your powers in the pursuit of wealth, and the only reason that you think otherwise is because you're reducing your sense of power to your buying power, your purchase power, which is a very minimal, if we're going to talk about the fullness of the human person, it's just a very minimal part of what he can do.
Yeah.